Biographers of Burton tried to ignore Isabel's contribution to his work.
She's very often written out the story.
You just look at these two individuals and you wonder, how on earth could they come together?
All of a sudden, it doesn't seem such a radical choice for her.
Richard Burton's story has been told many times. His wife's has not. Isabelle Burton was one of the most extraordinary women of the Victorian age. Almost nobody knows her name. And when they do, it's just for one act after the end of his life.
It would be easy to characterise her as quite a passive character in this story, just because nobody mentions her. She's very often written out the story, and if she is written into it, she is Richard's wife. She is secondary to him, and the one story that does come up is the story of her burning his manuscripts after he died, but it's very often her only part of the story.
The burning of books represents an element of censorship, and usually proceeds from a cultural, religious, or political opposition to the materials. And in this situation, it's Richard Burton's manuscripts.
And she is very often demonised by people who, fair enough, quite upset by the fact that she destroyed source material, and all historians are upset when they can't have source material, but that's not only who she was. She was an adventurer and a traveller, and she explored the world and she explored culture, and she was a great writer. She's a fantastic storyteller, and she's just a really fascinating person, and I've really enjoyed learning more about her. A lot of this information comes from her memoirs and her biography of her husband. Isabel is part of a very old landed Catholic family. She had a very strong Catholic upbringing. When she talks about her childhood, she mentions quite a strict upbringing, but she was very happy. She grew up in Essex in the countryside. She loved reading and writing. She wanted to be out and about and looking for adventure at all times. And that really manifests itself through the rest of her life. She went on a tour through Central Europe down to Italy and to Switzerland. The scenery is so sublime and so interesting. She's on the lookout for brigands, and there might be a torrent that they can't pass. There's one road that's particularly notorious, and she's like, oh, maybe we'll get some action, get some adventure, and nothing happens. And she goes, alas, not even a ghost of an adventure. She also has her fair share of issues. She is robbed at one point. She loses keys, she loses things break. She does a lot of praying when that happens. She's always looking out to the world and looking for adventure and excitement. We have this interesting juxtaposition where she is seeing herself as separate to Victorian femininity, but also really working within it. And when she becomes a wife, she is the ideal version of a Victorian wife. She's doting on her husband. She supports him in everything that he does. Her whole life is based around Richard and Richard's life. She is that rebellious spirit who wants to be outside and experiencing cultures in a way that other Victorian women were not encouraged to do, and she's quite unusual for that.
Isabel grew up in a world of strict Catholic values and rigid social expectations. But she was also drawn to the edges, to Romany culture, to fortune-telling, to the idea that her life had been mapped out by forces beyond the drawing room. In an age when women's futures were decided by family, men and class, the prophecy gave her permission to want something different.
The Romany prophecy is something that she goes back and refers to multiple times throughout her life. So in her memoirs, she goes back and she picks up certain points in her life where this is an example of where the prophecy has come true. This is something that's happened once she's lived her life, and she can go back and say, oh, of course it was all destined to happen. The prophecy states that she will be taken overseas, her destiny lies abroad. A very specific part of the prophecy, and this prophecy was given to her by her friend called Hagar Burton. Burton is a very old and well-established name in the Romany community. Hagar Burton says to her, when you are older, you will bear the name Burton. So they meet on the ramparts in Boulogne, and she has no idea who this man is. He's this tall, dark, handsome stranger. She describes his appearance in great detail. She's absolutely enthralled with him just by looking at him. He's got these strong features and dark eyes, eyes that sort of pierce your soul, sort of a grumpy temperament that is really intriguing to her. And she sees him, she's absolutely amazed by him and drawn to him. She turns to her sister and says, that man is going to marry me. And it is later revealed to her that this man is called Richard Burton. And she sees this as like all the things that this prophecy has said is all coming together. 10 years later, they do get married and she travels the world with him. She just takes every opportunity by the horns and she just really makes the most of everything. She lives this really rich and full life.
She was his editor, his advocate. his nurse, and ultimately his keeper of memory. We have to wonder, was that devotion or was it disappearance? A life so full and yet so entirely organised around one man. Richard and Isabel met in 1851. They did not marry for 10 years. During that time, Burton went to Mecca, East Africa, and North America. They finally married in 1861.
So Isabel was deeply in love with Richard. She was almost obsessive with it. They meet in 1851. They court for a bit. The way that they communicate for the first time is through messages written in chalk on the wall. And he says, "I want to talk to you," or something. And she says, "Oh no, my mother will be annoyed." And then her mother was annoyed, but this is what opens up their conversation. And then they meet again and they dance together at a ball. And she keeps the gloves and the sash that she wore when they danced together, and she never wore them again. She kept them for the rest of her life. When he leaves to go on his journeys, when he goes to do the Hajj, and when he goes to the source of the Nile, she follows his story through newspapers. She receives some letters from him, but she is following him every step of the way. When she's on her journey to Italy and Switzerland, they get to Nice, and she says her favourite part of that whole journey was sitting on the beach on the south of France with her face turned towards Africa, because that's where Richard was.
Whilst he was away on his expeditions, she worked on various projects, helping numerous people. For example, the Stella Club.
So she helped to establish a little league of her own, who she worked using Portobello House as her base for the opportunity of caring for some of the common law wives of many of the Crimean War veterans. And they were many not acknowledged by the War Department, had no money, and so she spent her time caring for those whilst they were apart before they were able to marry, that she spent her time in reaching out to those in need.
It was part of her understanding of her duty as a wife to be well educated and to, mostly in a way so that she can be interesting to him. She has this whole list of rules of when she's married. Some of those rules involve, well, I have to be well read because I need to be able to keep pace with him in conversations. I need to be willing to do lots of different things and experience lots of things that we can have interesting conversations and I'm not a bore to him. She's pushing the boundaries of what women could do. But again, coming back to that point of she's very much fitting herself within that role of wife, of being of service to her husband. Isabel was great at doing society. She went to all the right parties and she could host the right guests, fulfill all the diplomatic parts of being a consul's wife. And her education was to be a really good wife and to be able to support her husband in society. Richard was seemingly quite a difficult man socially. She talks about how he sort of looked at life with contempt generally, and he was difficult to get on with. So in that sort of social area of making them enjoyable to be around and him to be able to get more jobs and network, I suppose, she was very, very good at that. And then on a more practical note, she was a well-connected, wealthy woman, or from a wealthy family, from an old family, and those connections that were already in the diplomatic service meant that he was able to get the jobs that he wanted. So the job that he got in Damascus, the consul at Damascus, which was really a goal for both of them, she had expressed interest in that part of the world from childhood. This is all her. This is not just because he wanted to go. This is very much like from her own interests as well. It's her familial connections that get him that job. And I think that's a really important part of the story, because without her being there, having the right parties and being the good wife and fulfilling that role in society, I think he would have struggled to have done as many things and has got the positions that he wanted. She's a very important part of his story, and which is why it's a shame that she's written out so often, because his story doesn't really exist without her.
Biographers of Burton tried to ignore Isabel's contribution to his work, but really she should be seen as having been the commercial arm of the Burton publishing business, because in the last quarter of his life, a major source of income was the income from the books he wrote. And he obviously physically wrote them, but it was usually Isabel who made sure that they were typewritten, made sure that contacted a printer, checked on the proofs, etc., etc., etc. Without Isabel, I'm sure Sir Richard Burton would not have been as successful in the latter years of his life as he was.
Victorian society had a very clear idea about what a woman should be, and on the surface, Isabel seemed to fit that. She smoothed Richard's controversies, defended his reputation in the press, and stood faithfully beside a man who was, by most accounts, notoriously difficult to get on with. Burton's diplomatic postings took him to some of the most remote and inhospitable places in the world. Isabel was not permitted to join him at his first posting in Fernando Po, off the coast of West Africa. Their first home as a couple was in Santos in Brazil.
She was not the only woman living in the empire at the time. There are lots of wives of diplomats and consuls, but she really took it that extra step further to accompany Richard to do all of the things that he did. When they were in Brazil, they wanted to go and inspect the gold mines in the region. And they go on this massive trek, and it's really uncomfortable, but she's right there with all the men, and she's on horseback and with donkeys and walking and sleeping in the same conditions as them and eating the same food as them and right there with them. And then they get to a mine, and the superintendent of the mine says to Richard, should we go down and inspect it? And Isabel says, well, I want to go down as well. Everyone thought that was completely strange and very unusual. Why would a woman want to go down? But she insisted that she would. They thought it was very strange because the wife of the superintendent, who had lived there for over 9 years, had never been down. And actually the wife of the superintendent decides, well, if she's going down, I've never had the courage to do it before, but because you've encouraged me, I'm going to go with you. When they're coming back from the desert in Syria, and she's been riding on a horse for hours, and she's so exhausted, and I think she breaks down in tears at one point, and all the men just laugh at her. There are periods where she's really not respected, but the fact that she really prides herself on being able to sort of rough it with the rest of the men. She wants to be helpful, so she's there, she's mending things, she's doing medical care on the men, she's cooking, she's sorting out their living situation, but she's still there with them, dealing with the climate and with sandstorms. She's experiencing everything, but she's also experiencing them in dresses. And she's got a woman's anatomy. I mean, it's never mentioned, but she would have had periods when she's doing the expeditions. None of that is mentioned. And when you look at the great things that Richard did, and you ignore the fact that she was there doing basically everything the same, it's a real disservice to them and to their story.
The 19th century was a time when Catholicism was becoming increasingly accepted and widespread in spite of ongoing tensions. Isabel was a devout Catholic. Richard had no fixed religion. He'd studied and practiced Islam, Sikhism, Hinduism and Buddhism, all considered religions of the East. And yet, they made it work for 29 years.
He was a very, very spiritual man, and he was very interested in lots of different religions, but because he couldn't be pinned down to one thing, that was a concern for her family. They decided that as long as any children that they may have would be brought up Catholic, that they were married in a Catholic way, that they would be buried in a Catholic way, then the marriage would be fine to go ahead. One of her other rules for being a wife, she was not to talk to him about religious things. I think they both kind of accepted that they had their own views on religion and spirituality, and that they would sort of allow the other person to do what they needed to do. She could guide him and encourage him to be good and look after the poor and follow these Christian values, Catholic values, but she wouldn't actively try and convert him. Also, very personally, she could follow her religion as much as she wanted. He never stopped her from doing that. She never pushed him on converting. They both lived. Part of the really nice and loving part of their relationship was that they loved each other anyway. When you are two people who are very adventurous and have experienced a lot of the world, there will be an acceptance that not everyone has to believe the same thing.
Richard Burton died in Trieste in October 1890, aged 69. Shortly after his death, Isabel burned a number of his manuscripts, personal papers and diaries. She believed she was working in his best interest, but the literary world has never forgiven her. The question of why has never been fully answered.
Now, when we look at what Isabel did immediately or shortly after Burton's passing, this legendary burning of many of his manuscripts, like unedited or edited manuscripts, his personal papers, maybe some of his diaries. Today, you just look at these two individuals and you wonder, how on earth did they come together? But it was a different world. Lady Isabel was from a deeply devotional Catholic family, one of the great Catholic families of the 19th century, the Arundels. Burton, for all intents and purposes, had no time for Christianity. Isabel played a huge role in managing Burton's image. She was the equivalent of a PR manager today. This was clearly an act that was meant to shape that image in the way she wanted it to be shaped. She speaks about protecting her husband's image. Now, protecting him from what is the question that's never been answered, really, because she refused to describe what the contents of those papers were. And I mean, she was a smart lady. She knew the minute she mentioned it, that would destroy the whole point of burning the papers. We know that Burton's friends were deeply upset with his Catholic burial and his Christian funeral, and many of them refused to attend. There are many, many papers written by them expressing this dismay, in some cases disgust. Some felt that there is no way Burton would have personally agreed. But then on the flip side, with Isabel's writings and other people who have commented on it, it would appear that maybe Burton did want that kind of ending, something that he didn't communicate to those friends, or those friends were not aware of. The act of destroying those papers was, one, an act of control, clearly, two, an act to manipulate the image in the mould that Lady Isabel wanted her husband to be perceived as. And finally, there were clearly things in there that she was not comfortable with.
She writes to the paper to tell everyone that she's done it, is around protecting his reputation. Almost the entirety of her relationship is about protecting his reputation. She talks about how she should always, she will always speak well of him in public, and she will not allow people to speak disrespectfully of him. So even when he was alive, she was working a lot behind the scenes to make sure that his reputation was positive and not being damaged.
We know that she was able to, sadly, destroy much of his later works because she thought that the perfume garden, or the scented garden as he was going to translate it to, the ways that many saw it as pornography, that resulted in her destroying both his journals as well as perfume garden. The loss to literature has been seen as catastrophic by the detractors of Lady Isabel. Her view was based on the fact that, well, what's out there is out there, and what I have isn't going to add to the scholarly work or his reputation.
Obviously, as a student of history, I'm very disappointed that she burnt his diaries. But we have to remember that at the time, that was considered quite normal. Even in my own personal life, my mother kept a diary from the early 1950s, and she asked me to burn them, which I did, even if I was very sorry to do so, because they would have chronicled the history of an ordinary British working class family. That's what she asked, and that's what I did. Isabel's burning the diaries, especially at that time, wasn't so unusual.
When you put all of the context of her life back into the story, if you take this one chapter, this one act on its own, it seems incredibly destructive. But when you add her life back in and you learn more about her and her personality and how she approached their relationship and what she felt her role was as the wife to look after Richard in life and in death, all of a sudden it doesn't seem such a radical choice for her. It makes a lot more sense when you know the steps leading up to it.
Isabel died in March 1896, aged 65. She spent the last 6 years of her life writing both her memoirs and a biography of her husband, continuing his legacy and visiting the mausoleum she had built for them both in Mortlake.
Lady Isabel was the really force of nature that she was. It's wonderful that one of the ways that they describe her devotion to him, alive or dead, was a veritable passion. It appeared in every detail.
So there's no version of Richard's story that could be told without her in it. And people have tried to, but we're not doing that anymore.